So tonight we are delighted to welcome wonderful speakers from around the world. Lori Adelman from the Global Fund for Women, where she's Vice President of Influence and Engagement. She builds partnerships to fund and advocate for gender justice movements, in particular at the grassroots level. And she's also a celebrated feminist writer, being the founder of the Feminist blog, which some of you will know, and writing for Rookie Mag, Elle Magazine, and the New York Times, amongst others. So I'm going to ask Lori a bit about her work and the path that she's taken from media making to philanthropy in a moment. And for the first part of the evening, Lori and I are going to explore some of her work in feminist philanthropy and her thoughts on the inherently political nature of charity. We'll look at some of the big ideas in philanthropy, like effective altruism, but think of it through a gender lens, and reflect on how these help or hinder the work of activists who are really at the coalface of social change making. So then I'll turn it over to you for questions, both from those here in the room and also from people online. The questions will be coming to me, so please do put them in the Q&A bit of the Zoom online meeting, and they will get to me. Okay, so let's start. Lori, hello.
Hi.
So tell us, what are you working for on the Global Fund for Women at the moment, and how did you personally come to this type of work?
Sure, and thank you so much, first of all, to everyone who has been so welcoming. I've had so many amazing tours already and learning so much about this amazing place, and it's such a great room. I'm really looking forward to this conversation. So as you said in that lovely introduction, I work at Global Fund for Women. We are a feminist fund, and we are part of a network of feminist funds that work at the local, regional, national, and multi-regional level. And what really distinguishes a feminist fund from other kinds of NGOs or foundations? It's very simple. It's not necessarily our feminist lens, although we do have that, but it's really this idea that we don't set the agenda from where we're sitting. We don't decide on the programs and the policies that other people should take up. We support grassroots leaders, groups, movements with unrestricted funding as much as possible, multi-year funding as much as possible, core flexible funding as much as possible, so that they can determine their own priorities and their own work. And I cannot emphasize enough, it sounds easier than it is. And I did not start my career in philanthropy. I actually have been myself, as you mentioned, an advocate, a media maker. And I sort of arrived at this conclusion, and we can talk about this, that the how of the funding is so connected to so many issues that people who care about things like equality and justice and all of these big words. If you care about these things, and I think right now many of us do, and many of us, if we're paying attention, are very concerned about the state of these things, you need to follow the money, and it's not only the who, but the how.
Yes, that's so true. And can you tell us in particular for the students in the room who might be the beginning of their careers, just briefly how you made that transition from your original kind of media work through into philanthropy, which is a kind of it can be seen as an elite kind of profession, right?
Absolutely. And I want to address that right away, because I do not come from that background. I'm not someone, even global development outside of the philanthropy space is a very elite space. I did not grow up, I didn't have a passport until I went to college. I did not grow up traveling the world. I did not grow up understanding that was even something that was possible to get into as a career, that you could connect with people around the world as part of your day job. That just wasn't even something that was on my radar. I grew up on the East Coast of the United States. I was born in Philadelphia. I grew up with a single mom. We lived a very humble life. I was very loved, but I did not come from these sort of elite circles. And I say that just because I think it's important to sort of take some of the air out of these big ideas and just make sure everybody knows that it's possible, and it's important to engage with some of these high-minded or big-seeming institutions. And so I always knew that I wanted to go into some sort of gender justice work. Growing up as a woman of color in the United States, there were just so many ways that intersectional feminism spoke to me, and I wanted to be kind of part of those movements. So I ended up working within feminist NGOs as I started out as interns, and I was sort of working my way up. And all alongside that, I was having these day jobs, and I found a community in New York of feminist media makers, and we were part of online communities together that were really having success in taking control of different conversations online and really having an impact with our voices. And that was what feministing became a part of. And I found that as feministing grew and increased in size and scope, we also really had a target on our back as young feminists, as people who were very visible in the early days of the internet. I think it's in many ways become a more corporatized digital space, but there are still so many human rights defenders and advocates and people who speak up who get targeted for doing so, and there's not a lot of protections for them. And so for me, and for many reasons, both financial and because of the high visibility and high stress, we ended up, after 12 years, we decided to shut down the site, having, I think, accomplished a lot of things that we wanted to accomplish, but knowing that there was still a lot more to go. And so one of the things that happened through feministing was that I saw sort of the power of advocacy, but I saw also what happens when there's not protection, there's not funding, and there's not institutions to support emerging and very energetic movements and conversations. And so I saw that sort of lack of infrastructure. And as my professional career developed, I jumped at the opportunity to kind of work within spaces that were thinking at a more structural level about how to build spaces and platforms for people to connect with each other, speak truth to power, and talk to each other outside of what might be more traditional patriarchal entities.
So what you've painted there is a picture of a life coloured by activism and feminism.
Yeah.
So it's political, right?
Yes.
So how does that political slant, how does that kind of sit with your current work in philanthropy and charity?
Yeah, and I'm so glad you raised this. Okay, let's just talk about, if there's one thing I want people to understand, it's charity is political. Charity is the conversion of capital into power. You are enacting something onto someone else's body every time you decide to give money to a specific cause or a specific organization, or you are engaging, however small, in an act of world building. And when folks do that at scale, folks who have a lot of money and a lot of capital, when they do that at scale, there is a huge impact from that, and the ripple effect is felt. So how I like to think about it is, let's say you give $5 to, you have GoFundMe in the UK or any type of online fundraiser. Let's say you give $5 to an online fundraiser. You might not expect, just because you gave that $5, to then be able to have a one-on-one conversation with the person who's running that GoFundMe, so that you can tell them all your opinions about what they should do with the money once the GoFundMe is over. But people who are giving $1 million or $5 million or $200 million to create a center at a university, or start a wing of a hospital, or to even to a political campaign, which isn't thought of as, it's not traditionally charity, but it's an act of using money to pursue power, they are going to expect hours and hours of sitting down, talking to that person, talking to the people who are in charge of that budget, and determining with and for them what ends up happening to that money. So it becomes very transactional, and you can start to see, once the scale gets bigger and bigger, in the US, we're talking about over $400 billion a year, just in dollars, not to mention time and material and donated goods, but just in hard dollars of influence that's going into charity every year. And so you start to see how the whims of the very rich and the priorities of the very rich are quite literally being used to determine not only what we might think of as beneficiaries of charity and the world that they're living in, but the world that all of us are living in.
Yeah, it's very powerful. So taking that then, and I should remind people, do put questions in the chat, and those of you online, because we can pick them up. And as Lori said, her point about charity being political is really at the core of her thinking. You've talked about feminist philanthropy a little bit at the beginning there, but can you give some color to that for the people in the audience? Give us some sense of like what does this feminist philanthropy look like?
Yeah.
And I guess to some degree, like also, is it novel?
Yeah, exactly. And it's a great question. It's not novel, and women's funds in particular, like the Global Fund for Women where I work, have been around for over 30 years. And really what feminist philanthropy means is that you're funding with an attunement to power. So you understand that power is baked into a lot of the transactions that we're used to doing on a day-to-day basis. And so you're actively trying to shift that power towards communities that might be historically marginalized or have less access to resources, for a variety of structural reasons. And so when we look at how women's funds or feminist funds give and operate, they operate according to some core feminist philanthropic principles. I mentioned some of them before, but really a number one is giving unrestricted dollars. So feminist movements have long been able to be agile. We saw this with the COVID-19 pandemic. Folks who were used to running one sort of health center or advocating for one sort of issue very quickly pivoted and were just like, my community needs food right now, or they can see what their community needs in real time. So it's pretty inconvenient in the middle of an emergency to have to go back to a funder and say, please, can I have a new grant, or can you, re-budget my grant so that I can do this instead of that? No, you should, it's your money. You know what your community needs best. And so a core principle of feminist philanthropy is core funding. You also want to give multi-year so that folks can actually do long-term strategizing around the work that they're doing. And then the last one is just building on deep-seated relationships that you have with people. So engaging in trust and community building, and not operating from a place of suspicion. We hear so much about foundations or funders wanting to prove that they're spending their money wisely, or that the group has done the most possible that they could do. And that's a pretty difficult way to create social change together.
Yeah, I want to come back to that idea about the proof and unpick that a bit more a little bit later on. But before we do that, you talk a lot in your work about movements. Can you tell us, like, what is a movement, and how does it differ from other ways of fighting for social change and social justice?
That's a really fun question. And I imagine that if folks are here in this room, they have maybe some relationship to movements, or they have an interest in gender justice, or in philanthropy, or in both. So I'm curious, like, also you're engaged with movements and would like to talk to you about this. But at Global Fund for Women, we've basically engaged in a big bet. And I am coming from a place of vulnerability because, truth be told, we don't know if it will work. But the big bet is that we feel, and the research shows, that movements work. Movements bring about social change. And I can talk about some of the research because it's really interesting. But movements bring about transformational social change. It is messy work. It does not always look like a traditional beneficiary, but there is a lot of research, and some of the most interesting research is coming from a woman named Laura Weldon at Simon Fraser University, who, in partnership with Global Fund for Women and some other organizations, has issued a number of white papers that show, basically along a number of issues, that when you look at movements from between the 70s to the 2000s, and if you look at feminist movements, let's say take the issue of violence against women. Feminist movements have been more impactful at bringing about policy change at the national level around violence, stalking, trafficking, rape, all of these things, that by which statistics and numbers around impact of violence follow the policies, more so than a left-wing candidate or representation of women in government. They've isolated for all these variables and found that it's actually the organizing itself that brings about these changes. And so we have these entities that are bringing about transformational social change, but historically, philanthropy just hasn't touched it, because philanthropy is like, oh, we'll just give out 200, we'll just make sure that we hit X number of beneficiaries of X number of medications, and we've checked our boxes. And that's only slightly an exaggeration, but there is a lack of support and interest in even the question of how to support movements. And so when we look at movements, we have our internal definitions. There's a lot of interesting literature about what differentiates an organization versus a movement. You could really boil it down to, if you like a metaphor, maybe an organization is a tree and the movement is the forest. That's one way people like to think about it. Organizations have internal priorities, so they set a mission, vision, values. Movements are adapting to the world around them and might have shifting or priorities or have agility. But we use certain criteria internally. So if a collective is expressing a grievance or a set of grievances in public, if there's some sense of longevity over time, some sense of collective identity, we look at all of these things. And actually right now we're piloting a number of movement-led approaches, meaning how can we as an organization have an approach that is movement-led? How can we actually be led by movements instead of the other way around? And we're doing that with 10 movements right now at all different stages of a movement life. So emerging movements to movements who have actually had some sense of achievement and then maybe are now experiencing backlash or a lull, which also the literature shows is a built-in expected part of social change.
Of course. And so can you give us an example of one of these experiments or bets you're taking?
Yes, absolutely. And I should say, so we are piloting these approaches with a number of movements, and some of them you've heard of, some of them you haven't heard of, some of them are named, some of them are not named. We also, because we have this history of funding organizations, we also have we're in this interesting place where we've been funding organizations that are now part of transformational movements, but we didn't fund them as such. So in that second category, I don't know if folks have been following what's going on in Latin America or the Green Wave. There's been an incredible wave of successful activism around liberalizing abortion rights and abortion policies. So they are known as the Ni Una Menos movement, and they have really done incredible job at mobilizing massive amounts of people, and seen success from Argentina to Mexico, in some of the most Catholic countries in the world. They have been able to liberalize abortion rights. You all know what country I'm from and how painful it is for me to even be talking about that fact right now, but we obviously have a lot to learn from them. And so there are several, many different actually chapters of Ni Una Menos. Global Fund for Women has been funding some of those chapters for years. So actually the mobilization that resulted in legalization of abortion in Argentina happened many years after we had been funding that movement. And you have to think about it as laying the groundwork, creating infrastructure for that spark to be able to be lit. And so that's kind of one way that we've been doing. But with this new movement-led approach, we're working with, even at the global level, like a movement like MeToo is one of our movement-led approach pilots. That's multi-regional, global north-based actually, but there are hundreds of groups, both kind of in direct contact with Me Too and Tarana Burke in the US and not so, who have taken up that mantle and are carrying it forward. So with that approach, we're really interested in the question of, well, after they've had this viral moment and now they're facing this period of immense backlash. I mean, we all saw what happened with, just to take one example, the Johnny Depp and Amber Heard trial, where you're actually seeing a concerted effort to push down in the face of this progress. So as soon as you see a little, bud coming out of the sidewalk, they're pushing it down. And so how can all of those groups around the world be in touch with each other and be responsive to these moments? We're also looking at groups organizing around violence issues. So we're piloting our approach in places where they're in occupied territories, where in Palestine they're working on violence issues, both state-sanctioned and intimate domestic violence, and connecting those two issues together. And there's a loose network of women's groups that are working on that, which I think is a super interesting example. There's actually several that work on violence in different ways. We're also looking at several who work on an expansive view of sexual and reproductive justice. So both in East and West Africa, there's two separate movements which involve like both a combination of service providers and advocates, folks who run abortion hotlines across, Pan-African abortion hotlines, who want to be in conversation with other folks doing that same work. And so, these are just different examples, and some of them are very early, some of them are, sort of later, and we're trying to figure out what are the common threads, what does our support need to look like? And really, I think we're very interested to know like what other groups are trying to tackle this question, because also historically there are examples that you can point to where large influxes of money have been harmful to movements, and you can probably think of some off the top of your head. Even there's some modern examples that have really broken my heart. And so one of the things about that we're noticing, and also the feedback that we're getting, is that money isn't always the thing that is the definitive success, the definitive reason for success. And so it's actually a combination of things. It's relationships. A lot of groups are wanting to be talking to each other and not giving the space for that. Of course, money does help, and money is important, but it's also frameworks, tools, tactics, and being in conversation with each other and in solidarity that that's one of the lessons that we're starting to learn, is that money isn't everything, but of course, it matters a lot.
Yes, and disproportionately women's groups don't have money, but you're right, clearly there are risks of when you introduce money into these mutual type agreements or whatever. And for the people you're funding, then it can come coupled in traditional ways of doing this with lots and lots of monitoring and evaluation.
Yes.
So why don't you talk a little bit about this data and evidence setup?
Let us talk about it. And first of all, let me just say, I like data. Like I know I want to read the room. I know I'm in an academic setting. I know we love our research and our evidence. I love my research and my evidence. Like I love the studies that show like, hey, women's movements work. Like I use that. We partner with lots of academics and research groups all the time. That being said, I think if you do know data, you know that there is rampant confirmation bias. So lots of us are out here looking for the data that tells us what we already wanted to know. Like that's a thing, we know that. But we also know that global South feminists have been critiquing data-driven and obsessed frameworks of aid and of funding for many, many years. And they've been doing so for a good reason. And that's because data is not the only thing that we need to be thinking about when we're thinking about how to fund what works. And the reason that I say that is because if you think about some of the greatest historical leaps and jumps that we've made around gender justice issues, or it could be another issue that you care about, climate, etc., I think you'll find that there's very often an element of surprise, risk, coincidence. Factors come together that we couldn't have predicted, and the work is very messy. It's very hard retroactively to go back and say, this is exactly why this change happened. Of course, there are very big, expensive studies that go and try to do that and point to that. But at the end of the day, the approach of the how of funding means that we need to look at how can we get out of our own way and listen to the people most impacted by the issues and start there. Start with their data. What do they use to measure success? So once I, sitting in New York or Cambridge, have decided, here's what to me will mean this has worked, we've already lost, because we're already less able to be agile when the context shifts. If I've already set my policy agenda or my priorities, there's going to be a longer loop for me to hear and understand that that's not what's going on the ground anymore. And I'm always going to be saying, well, bringing it back to what's important to me and what data matters to me, which is fundamentally, frankly, a colonial, top-down, unfeminist, unhelpful framework. So to me, it really is about, it's not about data doesn't matter. Data matters, evidence matters, but it's about whose data and to what end.
And this does feel that you're, really somewhat fighting against the or reversing the tide towards the focus on effective giving, you know, of the kind of Gates Foundation type models that's based in a very capitalist mindset and as you might say, colonialist mindset as well.
Yeah. No, it really is, and this is something. I mean, I would love to talk to folks in the room about this. I sort of know I came ready to kind of hear more about where people's minds are in this because I know it's, you know, something that's really caught on. We hear a lot about the effective altruism movement and you know, a lot of just the data-oriented foundation work, of course. What do I want to say about this? It's good to want to do good. It's good to want to do the best good. That's great. That is fundamentally a self-reflective desire. You want to feel that you have done the most possible good that you can do with your money, and that's a goal that you can have, and that's okay. But there is something, I think, deeper, more exciting, and a more solidarity-oriented way of engaging with the world around you. And it takes into account that we are not living in an idealized society where you can measure and say, I've done the most possible good based on a data study that was done in a vacuum or done in a different context or, you know, done with an eye towards what I already thought was important. But recognizing that the world is really messy. There's no right answer to the best way to spend a dollar. There's always going to be an unintended consequence. And this is what drives me crazy about the EA movement, because I know they're really interested in unintended consequences. And it's like so close. Like I think that's exactly the right thing to be interested in, but not in the way that you're doing it. So like, you know, take a Gates, when they're working at scale, like they have the budget that's larger than many African nations' GDP, right? So they, like in 1 year. And so if they decide malaria is the thing, you know, you can work on malaria very, very efficiently and effectively, but there's no doubt that there will be many places where malaria is not the #1 killer or not the #1 issue that that community is facing. And many of the leaders, it's undeniable that the scale that Gates is operating at, many of the leaders will just take that money and work on that issue because that's the economy that we live in. And so effectively, you are killing more people. It's just I'm taking this on folks' own terms around data because you've now imposed your priorities on a place where they might have actual different needs based on what the community is asking for. And so that is, you know, a way to think about data is like malaria nets are the best use of money per life saved, but there are so many different factors and variables that go into that just make that, first of all, an impossible task to decide, but secondly, and more importantly, I think you could save a lot more lives if you think structurally, and not structurally 100 years from now, what an imaginary population might be thinking about, but structurally now, look around at the people, look people in their eyes as equals, look at all of the beautiful souls on this planet who are here with us today and struggling, and they're struggling because of inequality, rising fascism, authoritarianism. You know, there are pogroms and there are viruses and there are, you know, preventable maternal mortalities because of really, all of it is preventable really because of failures in leadership and really wealthy people holding on to a lot of the desire to control these resources.
So I'm going to ask one more question before we go to questions from the audience. So you've just sort of explained how even well-meaning philanthropists, and we know that, you know, most who work in this space, they are obviously trying to do their best, but it can damage and it certainly can exclude and marginalize women and other minoritized groups. Can you just talk a little bit about the threat from explicitly anti-gender movements that we're seeing at the moment?
Yeah, and thank you for that question. And it really does go back to that point about charity being political, because I think we want to think about maybe controversial and non-controversial issues under gender justice. So maybe think about what's the most innocuous issue under gender justice that we can think about, okay? Like mothers dying. Nobody wants mothers dying. Nobody wants violence against women. No one wants that, let's say, for the most part. you can take seemingly innocuous issues and very quickly move to what would be viewed as a more controversial issue within that. So, we know that if you don't want mothers dying in childbirth, a large percentage of preventable maternal mortalities come from unsafe abortion, and that would be considered a more controversial issue. That's very political. And so with anti-gender movements, and the same thing is true with violence against women, like we think that everyone's on board, but it hasn't been 20 years since 1/3 of people in a study across Europe said that violence against women should not be illegal. That's just the reality of the society we live in. And so where do these ideas come from? Where does fascism come from? This is something I've been thinking about. I don't know if you all have been noticing this, but I feel like, especially since COVID-19, and there's so many geopolitical factors that are, it's disinformation, but it's also just seething anger right under the surface. In America, we're having these conversations about the great replacement and population and all these discussions. So there is a backlash that is going on. And it's really important that we name that, because the backlash is very organized, and they certainly see charity as political. They certainly see their giving as political, the dollars that are political. We talked about EA a bit, and I actually think there's sort of another side of that coin, which is in my opinion, a version of kind of like a more feminized but authoritarian force. So if you think about like where trans-exclusionary radical feminism came from, to me, that is something that's emerging from the progress of seeing more gender diverse folks, of seeing younger populations feel more comfortable expressing their gender and having the real fear of that. That's the same impulse that is causing, Republicans and right-wingers in the United States to repeal Roe v. Wade, and they've been doing that for many, many years. Actually, since Roe v. Wade really came about, there has been a concerted effort to repeal that. But in recent years, very unpopular opinions that these fringe groups have been able to come into the mainstream because folks in the middle either don't commit and aren't engaged, or they're actually shifting to the right, and they're doing so because of all of these interconnected forces. So TERFs are talking to many different kinds of fascists and connecting the dots between what they see as a homosexual agenda, abortion rights, family planning, all of these things they see as connected, and they're rising up, not just in the US, but unfortunately globally.
Absolutely, certainly here in the UK. Okay, so we're going to go to some questions, and we've got some roving mics somewhere for people here in the audience. But I'm going to, so if anybody wants to raise a question, raise your hand, and one of our mic people will come to a mic with you, or come to you with a mic rather. But I'm going to start with a question from Sophie on Zoom. Thank you, Sophie. It's a question about the difference between a patriarchal approach to charity and a feminist one.
I love that question.
Do you think that there might be more anonymity in the feminist approach to charity, which creates space for everyone to participate in a way which is somehow decentralized?
Ooh, I love that question. Certainly philanthropy is very male dominated, that's for sure. And we know that, at least in the US context, only 1.6% of all charitable funds go to organizations run by women and girls. So really the default, like the overall just regular philanthropy that you see day to day is...
Lori told me that statistic when we had a pre-call, and I was staggered and made her talk about it again. So just say that again, yes. Lori.
Yeah, the vast majority of charitable funds do not go to women and girl-led or women and girl focused organizations. And when they do, they don't often go to grassroots led groups. So that's the 1.6 is a US based stat, but then you can look globally and see that even funds that are dedicated to gender, less than 1% of them actually make it to the grassroots. So there's a really huge issue, and I think women's funds are part of an infrastructure that's trying to fill that gap. So to answer the really good question, I think the patriarchal philanthropy is just philanthropy, unfortunately. Those are two of the same things. And feminist philanthropy, it does look different. Mackenzie Scott has been getting a lot of love for her approach, and I think it's really going in the right direction for those who are folks familiar with Mackenzie Scott and her. Yeah, so she is an author and was formerly married to Jeff Bezos. They got divorced, and she's been giving away as much money as she possibly can to as many groups as she possibly can, as fast as she possibly can, completely unrestricted. There's very, very minimal reporting requirements, and she does so anonymously. She like publishes a list on basically the most basic website possible, and she refuses to give any interviews about any of it. It's pretty interesting, and I think great. And full disclosure, we've received money from Mackenzie Scott, as have several women's funds, which is incredible. But I mean, I think that the difference is not necessarily only anonymity, but kind of all the things we've been talking about. And I certainly think there's less of a desire to kind of slap your name on everything within the feminist funding models that I've seen.
Yeah, I can imagine that. Okay, do we have any questions from here in the room at this stage? Should we go for the lady in pink, please, first? Thank you.
Thank you. Longtime fan of Global Fund for Women. So
amazing.
My question is actually a bit more about your journey.
Yeah.
It's very clear how your previous work got you into feminist philanthropy, but how did you get your head around and work your way into the international development side of that work? What was that journey?
Ooh, that is a great question, and I have so many complicated feelings about even the word development in the space. So would love to talk to you about, what your experiences have been too. But like I said, I mean, I did not know it was a thing. And, even today, I mean, it's an elitist space. There are a lot of people you meet and you're like, wow, they really know the space well. And then you find out like 3 months in working with them, like, oh, both your parents were diplomats, and like, that's cool, that's your journey, but that can't be like the entirety of the sector, especially if we're trying to have a little bit of get in on this reckoning that I keep hearing everybody's having. So my journey was really that I wanted to work on these issues, and it was INGOs, international NGOs, that kind of happened to have an opening and hire me first. And I think it was that combination of like luck, coincidence, being in the right place. I remember I got basically a communications assistant role at an INGO called the International Women's Health Coalition, and that was kind of my start. And I think importantly, they did not respect me until I had Feministing. Like, I think that's so important to say, because it's so hard to make a living in these spaces where it's kind of expected that you just are there for the mission and you must come from wealth, and like there's all these built-in assumptions still to this day, which I think are a big part of why the institutions as a whole have a lot of problems, like sort of taking on some of these more progressive values and changing from the inside out. So my experience was really started from the bottom, definitely also though had a lot of luck and privilege, and happened to have some good mentors, and then had a side hustle that forced people to maybe see that I could make something of myself within these institutions as well. Because they're also really old school, right? Like, I think having a website like Feministing, where we were making news just from blog posts that we were writing, a lot of NGOs kind of turned to me and were like, can you do that for us? I was like, you have a whole comms team. Like, what? why are you like this? So, I think there's also just kind of still an old school mindset that it's really important to disrupt. And sometimes I can't help but disrupt that just by my presence and being who I am. And, I've seen like Global Fund for Women is one of the few INGOs that's run by an African-American woman in the entire space. I mean, it's really rare. It should not be that rare. And it's funny, even the distinction of African American is like really rare. It's really hard for people to imagine, that leadership and to accept it, and to see credibility where there obviously is. So it is still a journey, and I think the sector has gone through a lot and needs to go through a lot more.
Yeah, that's certainly true in the UK as well, where we still see NGOs and charities, offering unpaid internships, which clearly just continue to embed privilege.
Yeah, not helpful.
Yeah, exactly. But there's a question here actually that relates to funding and funders. Layla on Zoom is a funder and is also a recipient of funding, so she has a foot in both camps.
Same.
Yes, because you've mentioned some of your funders. How does the Global Fund for Women report to its own funders, and how do you find the balance between your funders' expectations for a uniform data set, which can be aggregated, versus your need to collect a diverse set of data from your grantees? For example, if your funders are really interested in number of individuals reached or specific outcomes, how do you communicate them that funders and the public if you're not asking your grantees about that?
Yes.
So how do you,
Amazing question. And I think there's obviously like some practitioners in the room or on Zoom. So one of the main reasons to continue to be based in the global north, if you are working to support global south work, is to raise funds. And I think of it pretty clearly as washing the money. I'm straight up about that. You know, maybe it's not on the website, but that's how I describe what we do. You work with the donors, you find out their priorities. Their priorities are represented in the pool of work that you're supporting, but you do not pass along that mandate, basically. And I think that is the role. If you are a global north-based intermediary, that's what you should be doing. The work is matching work that is going on, that is changing social norms, changing realities, changing lives, to donors' self-interest and self-image. That is the work. It shouldn't be the work. None of this should be, but this is how it is. It is really hard for donors. Every donor thinks they're different. No donors are different. It is so hard for donors to not project their own. So how we do it is we do talk to our grantee partners. We do have really good relationships with them. They do tell us what's going on, but they don't do that because we've said, okay, here's a 20-page form that you are mandated to fill out every quarter. They do that because they're like, holy crap, we had just done a movement mapping with the Ukrainian Women's Fund, when this conflict started. And they were writing to us because they know us, and they had asks for us to bring out to the donor community. And they were telling us in real time, this is what's going on, this is what's needed. The humanitarian aid is very disjointed. There's too much of this, there's not enough of that. And so that's the kind of information that we take. And then, if we know that there's a donor who's interested in, let's say, women in conflict, that's the match. Of course, there are some things that we need to pass on, and I think, the key there is to be transparent as early as possible with the grantee partner about what taking that money is going to entail. And of course, that happens at times.
And do you have some quite tough conversations with the funders saying, yeah, no, we're not going to take that?
Yeah, and we also partner to do donor advocacy. So even within the Feminist Fund community, if we are all partnering with if we're all getting money from the same foundation, as many of us are, or, a same group of foundations, we'll push back together and to decide together, okay, this safeguarding policy that it's so ominous, what they're asking us to do, we're going to push back. Or anti-corruption is like a huge one that the requirements get so ominous and they're so racist ultimately. Yep. So we'll say, okay, it's actually you who needs us. You got to get rid of the money. So this is what we're asking for. And this doesn't always work, but this is like kind of, we have successfully done this in the past. And, partnering together to advocate with donors, it's a great way to kind of take the pressure off sometimes of, oh, well, if I don't just agree to whatever this donor wants, they're just going to go to the next grantee partner and I'm going to lose this opportunity. Well, actually, women's funds have organized together. So you actually have to, pay attention to what we're asking from you. And, there's really very little accountability within the donor space, but it's important to kind of start to have those conversations. And frankly, I think the past 2 years have been slightly humbling for some donors, for some really large donors. And so that's been interesting to watch.
And seeing how quickly people have pivoted, as you say, to respond to the actual needs on the ground.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think, we saw that with COVID, and in the U.S. there was a lot of talk about this racial justice reckoning after the murder of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and so many others at the hands of police, and so you start to kind of see those connections being made, and folks start to understand, but they still need those internal pushes.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, there was another question here in the room, please.
Yeah.
Hello.
So what I understand about effective altruism, they're really good at appealing to rich white men who come out on the top of capitalism, out of interest in data and evidence-backed studies. And that's a massive donor base and has been a large part of the success of the movement.
Yeah.
Is that also a donor base that feminist funds try to tap into? And if you try to, how do you do it?
That is a wonderful question. Thank you for that question. And you said it, not me. Everyone heard that. No, I think that's great. So first of all, yes, we are rich white men. We will work with you. We are open for that. But yeah, I think with EA, you're exactly right. That is what they're really good at doing. And part of it is this desire. I think it comes from a good place to say, like, I see things aren't working, and I want to be part of changing that, which, like, shared interests, same. But then I think where we get off track is going to that place of like, we alone have this like new solution that no one's thought of. And so, where I think feminist philanthropy can be really helpful is to give that historical context and say, like, hey, like, we've been doing this for a while, and to partner up. So there are examples where we've, like, when have we worked with really, rich white men? We do. We work with lots, and it's awkward to name them maybe in this context, but we definitely do. And I mean, I think in general, tech money, which I know is even in this room now and all around us, I think that you often see philanthropists funding in a way that reflects how they made their money. So it's not just the sort of latest crop, this goes back to like the oil barons, or like, people who, I don't know if folks pay attention to like the Gilded Age. There's like a show about like the women in society and how they used charity to like get in with the Red Cross because they wanted to be seen as like virtuous and caring. And people who make their money off of like fossil fuel related industries often want to spend their charity money on some sort of greenwashing effort. Like, there is this sort of cyclical thing where there is a connection between how you make your money, obviously, and then how you spend it on philanthropy. So, I don't want to project too much onto the EA movement, but my sense is that they've made their money by forging, many of them were in crypto or, in some sort of tech startup, and they've made their money by being really efficient, coming up with new disruptive ideas, right? These are buzzwords that you see in the tech community. And so they're wanting to apply that lens to the philanthropic world. But I think the challenge is, again, we don't live in like this clean bubble of a world where all of these rules are super clear. And, I think I'm trying to think of if I can disclose really some of the discussions that we've been having. I don't necessarily feel comfortable, but what I will say is, like, we are actually based in the Bay Area. We work with a lot of tech folks. We've had folks from Salesforce and Twitter on our board. We're not like hostile to any of those communities. I think there's a lot of actually interesting overlaps. Signal is another one that's doing interesting things. I think if folks are familiar with like DAOs and how DAOs have been fundraising, like I think there was some promise there, but the only concern is when you start to say, well, it's really not just that I've fundraised, but now I'm this woke mob that gets to decide. I think it's the who gets to decide piece that's really the challenging piece. And if DAOs were just raising money and giving them as unrestricted grants to to local grassroots charities, like, I wouldn't have a problem with that. But they're like wanting to see how much they can push, their own agendas or wild ideas in the name of being like really new. It's actually like that's what philanthropists have been doing forever.
So, talking of tech, we have a question from Zoom. Given the need for more feminist voices and opportunities to collaborate and so forth and organize, what do you think it would take to create an impactful platform like Feministing today? Like, what's the kind of platform space?
We were just talking about this. I mean, increasingly corporatized digital media is like the thing that I want to be talking about more. It really breaks my heart. We really, really need more independent, not just feminist, progressive media. And it's getting pretty dystopic, the media landscape. I think we need investment in independent platforms for the sake of independent platforms, platforms that are not responsible for subsidizing their like content with ads and ad farms. I mean, it's getting pretty dark. You know, one of the things that I saw with Feministing is also that the media literacy is changing over time. So, for example, when kind of Feministing was in its early days, I remember there was kind of a widely mocked person who had made money off of a sports website and decided he was going to use that money to invest in a women's website. And then he got a lot of media for that and created a woman-centered website. And the vision was really just like, no one's ever done this before. We're going to have like news and hot tips about makeup for women. And everyone was like, yes, everyone has done this before. This is like, exists and many times over. And today, that person's website is worth a lot of money, and no one sort of connects the dots between. He was widely mocked at the time, but our media literacy is not such that when we visit a website, we're taking in the politics of the owner or understanding how it was funded. Is it funded for is it for profit? Is it nonprofit? I'm guilty of it myself. Like even if you get those little pop-up boxes, it's you kind of click and move on. It's just not the landscape that we've built. So I do think we need to invest in independent media for the sake of independent media. I mean, Craig Newmark's doing some interesting work around that. The Knight Foundation. There's a lot of good journalism funding, but we just need a lot more of it. And I also think investment in media literacy, because it is alarming. I know, especially some of the, our elder generation, I think we've lost a lot of opportunities with them, and they're really struggling with understanding what's real and what's not real online, and it's a really big problem.
Yeah, I love the way that the school system has taught my children a million times over about safety online, and they know everything. It's my mum who doesn't understand.
Yeah, exactly, yeah. and they're so vulnerable.
Yeah,
it's a
exactly.
really big problem.
Yeah. So I've got another question here. How does your organisation, the Global Fund for Women, choose which movements to fund? Yes. Freya's saying that there's probably never a perfect, non-controversial movement in need of funding, and the decision-making process must be quite complex. Can you give us some insight into what that decision-making process looks like, and maybe even some things you decided weren't for you?
Yeah, no, that's a great one. So with this new approach that we're doing, first of all, we're always looking for amazing movements to fund. So like, talk to me about that. And so I would say it's a combination of two things: relationships and data. We like data. It's good actually, just not exclusively. So with relationships, we have a global network of advisors. They are movement leaders from their local contexts and countries, and they'll tell us like, this is popping off in my region, in my area, this group's doing amazing things, this is a movement, and we'll look at it from that perspective. And again, we have that internal criteria. So I shared some of the criteria around what is a movement. We also look at what stage is the movement in, and that's part of the pilot process that we're developing. Is there a particular stage of the movement where our support sort of means the most? So these are the kinds of questions that we've set for ourselves in terms of measuring and optimization. That's what we optimize for, not like are our priorities going to be carried out by this movement in the most efficient way possible, but can our help make the most difference to this person based on their set of priorities? It's like it sounds like a technicality, but it's actually everything. So we do that, and then we also are experimenting with using some social listening based on publicly available data. Not everyone is online. Huge caveats. AI is racist. Not everybody is online. We don't exclusively use online or digital conversations to look at this, but it's one area that we do look at to say, wow, conversation has really gone up around a certain topic in a certain area, or these people are really influential on this topic and they're all talking to each other. So that's another way that we're looking at things. And actually, I think that's a pretty cool one. And I would love to, like, I think that's an area, if you're really interested in data, you can support feminist philanthropy to still use data better to inform and support their strategy. That's still totally possible and on the table. It doesn't mean you have to, sit and do, back of the napkin calculations around how many malaria nets are going to get you the most lives saved so that you can, put on your pin here. But it is a way to support data. And so those are some ways. And I would say movements that we haven't funded. So we still are getting a ton of donors coming to us and they're saying, great, love that you're supporting movements. Like, can you support a movement on this topic that we care about in this area that we talk about? And that's almost always a no, because that's top down. That's like movement building. We don't do that. If there is a movement working on certain things that's in a certain phase of the process, then we'll do matchmaking with donors that we think might be interested. So that's kind of a scenario where we've, I think been pretty good about saying no. What other haven't we funded? I mean, we have just such a long list of movements that I think we would love to find funding for. And, one of the most interesting movements that we're funding right now is a lot of mostly women-led climate justice movements in the Pacific and Caribbean. And really, they are dealing with so much just so much adversity and so much change to their culture, to their community. And I would say you see this with all of the movements, but especially climate justice movements, they are so often overlooking that gender piece. So that's one that I think I'd really like to see us be able to support more movements around, and probably like a youth movement next. I think Fridays for Future is really interesting. And we've had some partnership and conversation with Fridays for Future, MAPA, they call it, or Most Affected Peoples and Areas, which is currently based in India. And they have a really interesting model as well that right now is not part of our movement-led approach pilot, but I would like to see it be someday.
That's interesting, because one of the things I wanted to ask you about is that this sort of approach to philanthropy can be perceived as philanthropy in general is kind of maybe a fairly Western concept.
Yes, yeah.
Are there alternative ways of kind of funding social change in other cultural contexts? And have you experimented with that at all, or thought about that a bit?
I love that question. I mean, yes, absolutely. And I would say yes and no. Maybe like the name philanthropy is, Western, but there are so many ways that so many different cultures express generosity way beyond what any Western model might suggest. And one of, I think, the most interesting things that combines a critique of philanthropy, a critique of Western philanthropy with a critique of Western feminism is just like third world feminists, so-called third world feminists, global South feminists. They write about, and they have been critiquing and writing about for decades, of the lack of gender analysis within anti-colonial movements from the West. So basically, this isn't necessarily about philanthropy, but this is about organizing. So many anti-colonial movements that originated and were successful in the global South were often critiqued by Western feminists for saying, they didn't have a gender lens and they didn't demand XYZ women's liberation on the terms that I have set around what feminism should mean and look like. And there's some really influential books, and there's one, Feminism in the Third World, that is a really amazing book, and it talks about how women participated in anti-colonial struggles very actively, and just the act of their participation, we were just discussing this, it was not only something that helped end colonialism in the region, which of course is like positive for the women there as well as the men, but also by their participation, women are viewed differently within the society, and they are more liberated by their own standards in terms of having been able to participate in this democratic process. And we see all kinds of connections between strengthened democracies and gender justice over time. So even just the Western notion of what counts as philanthropy, social change work, feminism, like all of those categories are so malleable and don't actually really make sense. We do really need to kind of like free ourselves from that. The other thing that I think is really interesting, there are all kinds of like super ethnically specific models of giving and all of these things, but just to speak to my own community, by the numbers, the African American community in the U.S. gives at a higher rate than any other group in the U.S. Now, we don't necessarily have as much, but we give more, and I think that's just fascinating to think about because there are just certain ethos in different communities that are often overlooked or not accounted for. So that creates a perpetuating situation where maybe like if Black folks, like some of the biggest issues that they care about are education, and that's historically informed, right? So if Black folks are giving to education, but they're doing so, not necessarily with an eye towards, again, putting their name on a building or anything, but just out of, an abundance of generosity and investment in their community, that might not register as traditional philanthropy. Maybe they haven't set up a fund, or maybe they didn't create like a DAF or a formal 501c3, but they're giving very, very generously, and they're part, and they'll give with an eye towards community in a way, and like research shows this, but it's just something that isn't always read in the same way as like capital P philanthropy.
I can imagine that.
Yeah.
So have we got another question from the audience, please? Let's go to the person in the blue dress here, and then we'll have the person at the back afterwards.
It's fun.
Oh, gosh. Right. Person in the blue dress, where you go.
So I was wondering what is and what you think should be the relationship between organizations like the Global Fund for Women and more sort of policy-orientated bodies like the UN or the OECD.
Yeah.
And whether you think those are sort of inherently paternalistic, and like how that might be recovered by feminist movements.
Ooh, like that. It's a good row.
Okay.
Okay, should we get?
You're a good row, that's what she just said.
Yeah. It's a great question. The short answer is they should give us money, especially OECD should give us money. We have an active campaign with fellow women's funds to up the percentage that is given to either us or grassroots feminist groups. And strangely, not strangely, but we've seen some success with governments investing in this work. I don't know if, folks, it was somewhat, it was received in kind of a mixed way, but Canada announced a feminist foreign policy several years ago and sort of upped their global funding on gender justice issues. They were critiqued for not necessarily upping their domestic funding at the same time, but it's still I think a step in the right direction. And there's several European donor governments who are making some interesting investments in that area. We engage the UN, we engage these governments. And I would say with the UN, the main reason that we do that is because the other side does it really well, and you don't want to create a vacuum. The UN just did something called Generation Equality Forum. I don't know how much that reached kind of the public, really, but they generated billions of dollars of commitment for gender justice from governments, from private sector, from civil society. It was an anniversary of kind of a global conference of women that took place in Beijing, where Global South feminists kind of hijacked that agenda. This was like over 20 years ago, and it's still sort of celebrated in UN circles. So there are sort of these active feminist pockets that are doing advocacy within the UN, working within the UN. I think that's still important to have, but to your point, I don't necessarily see it as like a site of transformational change. It's kind of one of those places where, you know, you want to make sure that they're investing properly, that we're not getting like regressive language and agree to conclusions at the Commission on the Status of Women or whatnot. But, you know, so you have to keep engaging, but I think it's important as part of a multi-pronged approach. I'll put it like that.
Thank you. And the person at the back, please.
Hi, thank you so much for your discussion today. Let me just introduce myself a little bit to contextualize my question, because I'm actually the person who worked in NGOs being funded by the Global Fund for many years.
Oh, amazing. Okay.
And I teach here now,
Okay.
but I sort of transitioned from working in NGOs for most of my life, starting as a very young person in Delhi with very feminist, very queer communities at a time when, you know, my mentors were people who went to that Beijing conference and
Yes.
subverted it.
Yes.
And in 1993, the women's rights are human rights. I mean, they went to places like that. So I was kind of like brought up by feminists like that, also very elite women.
Yeah.
And one of the reasons why I couldn't stay in those movements was because you couldn't make ends meet. Because so I ended up leaving a lot of those movements. I work in technology now, so I kind of like work on the data side of things. I also continue to maintain connections with a feminist organization in the Asia Pacific region called Arrow, which does sexual reproductive health and rights work there. And I'm really interested in effective altruism as what is it a response to? Because I understand this movement. I understand donors and philanthropy and being funded and having to write impact assessments and doing monitoring evaluation. What is it a response to? Where are its funds going, and how is it reshaping feminist philanthropy? Because there are things that are problematic about it, and I don't want to I'm calling in rather and saying that there are things that are sort of troubling about the way that I see groups that I'm associated with still having to do a lot of like data monitoring stuff that doesn't really work. And I understand this push to sort of capture the stories of long-term complex change, which feminist philanthropy supports, like, you know, decriminalizing homosexuality in many parts of the global south, which EA movements will not do, because you can't datafy that sort of long-term change and what it takes to inhabit the body of a person who is part of those movements. So I wonder if you could just sort of speak to how the feminist philanthropy is really taking on or confronting what's problematic about some of these structures of aid and reporting, but also I wonder if there's a positive outcome of that as well. So I'm not, thank you very much for the time to listen. I'm not apologizing for the long introduction to myself. I'm saying thank you very much for the space to listen. Thanks.
Thank you, and please never apologize for bringing your whole self to the space, and I so appreciate that. And I mean, I think you raised a number of different things I really just want to lift up. I think, first of all, like, no philanthropy is good or perfect at all. Philanthropy should not exist. We should have an equal society where no person has the ability to decide on funds for another person. Like, that in and of itself should not exist. And so following from that, there's all types of problems, and it is an imperfect system. And yeah, I would love to also like learn more about your advocacy and what you're doing now. I think in terms of what I think what I hear in your question is like, sometimes so-called feminist philanthropy, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, but this is what I'm hearing. Sometimes like so-called feminist philanthropy also passes along some of these problematic elements. And of course, I completely agree and see that. And so what really is maybe the difference, or how really are they differentiating themselves? I think it's a great question. I mean, to me, and you know, I have been on, you know, I've run programs, I've been on the receiving end of some of these things, but for the most part, I have been on that global north side for sure. I see it as saying something very different fundamentally from what EA is saying. To your point, I do not see EA as investing in long-term social structural change. I see feminist philanthropy trying to do that, very frequently falling short, But to my earlier point, being vulnerable, putting that intention out there, trying new things, and naming that as explicitly a political critique of existing philanthropic institutions. I mean, I think it's really interesting that you brought up the queer community in India, and I think that's another area where personally I've been very directly impacted and harmed by the lack of intersectionality that a lot of feminist spaces bring, not necessarily only global feminist spaces, but certainly global feminist spaces too. And I think we're only now and very barely wrapping our heads around not only race within the working conditions, but how race and ethnicity and caste are functioning globally, colorism, how queer rights and diverse identities actually fit into our movement. Like, these are active conversations. We have very often been on the wrong side of history. I see lots of times a need for internal solidarity among grantee partners and internal institutional change makers within feminist philanthropy entities to say, actually, this isn't working for me. Can you work on this policy or change that policy? And like I've seen good examples of that. And like, I think more solidarity is always the answer. So I don't really have an answer except to say, definitely not perfect, always needing to improve, but I do think still very fundamentally different from the EA. I'll stand on that.
So I think we can squeeze in one last question. So please, over here. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for your time. My question is, how do you measure the social impact of your fund? Because I understood that your argument is basically beneficiary-led, and I really agreed with that. I'm a researcher at the University of Barcelona, and we are leading research in gender violence. And what happened is that we normally, I agree with the approach of co-construct with the movements. We always do that. But we are seeing in Spain millions, and we bid for European funding normally. But in Spain, we have been seeing how private funding and sometimes with grassroots movement is gone to projects that are exactly exacerbating the problem and sorting it. So because it's not evidence-based, and if you ask to the beneficiaries, if you ask the teachers that has been trained, or the movement, or the women that have been trained, they say, oh yeah, we are really satisfied with the training that we had, but they are receiving messages that are exacerbating the problem. So I wonder how you measure the social impact, the improvements in your fund. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, and thank you for the work that you're doing around gender-based violence and all those issues. I think I'll answer two ways. So one, we do have indicators. We do have folks, who do self-reporting, and we keep track of these things. And I think one of the exciting things about shifting to the movement-led approach and doing these pilots is a lot of what we're measuring now is about our ability to provide the support that we have set out to provide, versus to say this direct, some change directly happened because of us. So it's more about measuring according to the movement's self-identified goals, how well did we support them to get there, if that makes sense. So again, it's subtle, but it's really important. So we're measuring how well we're supporting versus the outcome. And I think overall, like that's kind of the biggest difference is ultimately, I think it's worth it to waste some money to have that principle be in place, that principle of trust. So if they are maybe not living up to what the program is, sometimes I think that's okay. And what we also find is because of the relationships that we have, if there's truly something that's contributing to a problem or exacerbating gender injustice, we hear about that. I mean, I think like folks are, the other is not real. So it's not like those folks are so far over there that we never hear about or understand what the work is that they're doing. We have a very deep bench and a network of hundreds of advisors all around the world who are part of these communities. And they'll tell us like, very, very clearly when they are not happy with what's going on. So I think it is ultimately that framework shift of it's okay that some money is wasted. And again, we're talking about, I love my organization. I think we do a lot. We're talking about the scale is this big compared. We are a small fish in a big pond at the end of the day. And these ideas are, not the norm. And so I think it really is about shifting away from the idea that if we fund something and it doesn't work out, or it doesn't work out like we thought it would, that money has been wasted. And we really are trying to measure and be accountable in terms of the support that we're providing on the terms of the movement.
Lori, I'm afraid we need to draw it to a close now. I know, time flies.
It really did.
But thank you so much. Obviously, there's lots more we could talk about, and lots that I know myself and other people involved will be taking away. I particularly wanted to thank you for bringing in this word messy and allowing the mistakes that are an inevitable part of entering into these sorts of relationships in a genuine way.
I will bring it.
It's been a delight speaking to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.